Good afternoon to our lecturer, Dr. Benedict, and my fellow classmates. We are Group 15 are going to present a literature authored by Hugh Chenet regarding climate change and risk management. The paper lists out four elements in order. The first element that Chenet addresses is the history of how the financial system begins to realize that climate change is part of financial risk. The second element Chenet discusses is how to properly identify the types of financial risks that emerge from climate change. The traditional framework at which financial risk is identified could not capture the specific risk that climate change imposes. Therefore, climate related risk is identified into two categories. They are physical and transition risk. As the paper laid out the foundation to understand and identify the financial risk associated with climate change, the third element analyzes how both physical and transition risk are managed once propagated. The fourth element then focuses on the overview of financial regulations and key reporting frameworks that are placed. When scientific proof of global warming woke up policymakers and global leaders, the financial system was completely absent from the discussion. Initial sentiment regarding climate change were mostly apathetic, where it was treated like it was already there, like a common flu, and its repercussions had no adverse effects. Even if a major event was caused by climate change, they felt that an existing operational framework could resolve the issue effectively. This sentiment slowly changed, though, as the Kyoto Protocol, led by the European Union Emissions Trading System in 2005, distributed carbon quotas that companies can exchange for complying. The corporate investment banks saw it as an opportunity to capitalize on climate change to make profit. As many prominent key players in the financial system made a combination of initiatives which led up to a significant acceleration of climate change influence, European Investment Bank and the World Bank issues their first green bond, and China launching their green credit guidelines was a very big step. The turning point that led to where they understood that the financial system and climate change are intertwined was during the Paris Agreements, whereby the radical transformation needed to decarbonize the economy meant that the financial system had to play a vital role. That, in fact, climate change and the financial systems are two sides of the same coin.
The usual risks which happen in finance include liquidity, interest rate, credit, market and operational risk, which do not consider climate change as a risk in finance. This is because climate change is a rather new topic for financial institutions. Both in terms of knowledge and habit, risk manager and financial analysts are not familiar with climate-related risks. Since the recognition of the climate change problem 40 years ago, two aspects are set to differentiate the geophysical mechanism that produce global warming and the socio-economic process at the origin. The objective is to be fully decarbonized between the year 2050 and 2070. This means that the world must rely on an energy system which does not produce any greenhouse gas or be able to store emissions of greenhouse gas residual permanently. This is a hard challenge as our economies and infrastructures still rely on fossil fuels combustions. According to the TCFD report in 2017, climate-related risks can be divided in transition risk and physical risk. The transition to a global net zero carbon economy will undoubtedly have significant consequences on economic agents. Winners or industry can replace carbon-intensive technologies, and losers that are still relying on fossil fuels. Those consequences will probably impact the risk and profitability of financial assets. This constitutes the transition risk to the financial system. For example, the financial risk coming from the energy and industrial transition in the context of climate change mitigation. This transition risk can actually come from different direct and indirect sources, which are usually classified into policy and legal risk, market risk, and reputational risk. This clearly shows that the climate change can lead to financial risk. The other side of the coin consists in the financial risk related to the physical impact of climate change themselves. Global warming is a result of increasing greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. Those concentrations already exceed the safety thresholds, and because of the physical inertia of the climate system warming response, global temperature will continue to grow even if emission will stop now. Consequently, the impact of physical climate change are delayed in the future, and even if the first effect of climate change are already present and documented, they represent only a meager precursor of the most damaging consequences that are to materialize later, typically in a few decades, which is considered by most economic decision makers as long term. For financial decision makers, reputed short-sighted, this is relatively even further away in time. If the initial effect of climate change is temperature rise, the indirect impact are much more diverse. First, the warming effect from climate change is global, but with very high geographical and temporal heterogeneities, then it is indirect consequences of this warming that will impact our society the most, through modification of the climate regimes and their related impacts. Physical risks affect the operation of organizations, potentially damaging their assets, affecting the supply chain, affecting the condition of work as well as the demand sides of clients and citizens. As such, physical risk can have financial implications for those organizations, which may propagate to their valuation of risk profile via impact on their income, cash flow, or balance sheets.
Are those new type of risks priced by market? Both physical and transition risks from climate change are not totally new, and the risks have somehow affected financial assets in the past. Climate-related risks should be able to be captured by the usual risk management framework, so there is no extra attention compared to different type of risks. But there are several reasons why this risk parameter might not currently be captured. Reason why climate-related risks may be mispriced. The first reason is unprecedented phenomena. There is no historical or statistical data available to compute the usual risk analysis that are performed in the financial market, especially financial assets which are sensitive to historical shock. Therefore, the future will not be repeating the past. The understanding of past events and crises will be just a little used to undertake classical risk management approach for climate change risk. The second reason is radical uncertainty. The distinction of risk and uncertainty in economy has been clarified relatively to the capacity to assess probability to possible event. Climate-related risk, and in particular transition risk, involve many situations of radical uncertainty, as opposed to so-called night-time risks, which are computable. The third reason is non-normal probability distribution. Climate-related risks are poorly fitting into normal distribution with significant kurtosis and scale, where black swan are the norms. The last reason is bounded rationality, where market players in the face of complexity may need to construct a simplified model of the real world in order to deal with it. But behaving rationally to this simplified model does not guarantee an optimal reaction to the real world. Therefore, despite climate change and related risks are now acknowledged by most financial institutions and financial system governance framework.
When it comes to managing climate-related financial risks, we must look at how these physical and transitional risks will affect the financial institutions. Physical risks occur when climate-related events destroy infrastructure, reduce production, and interrupt trade. For example, if a flash flood may hit a company's production facilities, which in turn will affect their scale of production, as they will no longer be able to produce at the same amount as they always have been. Transition risks, on the other hand, occur as the market transitions into a low-carbon economy, which means that new policies will be made along with legal, technical, and market adjustments that are all put into place in order to contribute towards climate change mitigations. This will affect how the business can operate as they have to constantly adapt towards such changes. However, these risks can also indirectly affect the financial institution, as it may affect its supply chain as well as its competitors. All of these changes could potentially have an impact on the revenues and expenditures of the financial institution. Such risks become an even bigger problem for multinational companies who have branches all over the world and are producing various different products and services, as they must account for each and every one of these branches, as well as the climate situation of the country which the branch is operating in. Lastly, we also have liability risk, which are impacts that could arise as a result of other parties who are affected from the effects of climate change and are seeking forms of compensation from those which they hold responsible. Other parties may put the blame on these financial institutions who are considered carbon extractors and emitters, as they see that they are part of the reason as to why the climate is becoming worse and ultimately had an effect in them in some way. This is also the reason why both physical and transition risks have to be considered when assessing for liability risks, as they both result in liability risk. So because of the uncertainties and numerous possibilities of what climate change may bring in terms of how it influences the market, it is nearly impossible to pinpoint exactly what the future may hold for a financial institution. This is why one of the most useful tools used by financial institutions is the climate scenario analysis. Financial institutions use this tool in order to prepare for all plausible futures that they may encounter, and by doing so will be able to assess all possible risks that come along with each outcome and prepare accordingly for them. This allows the financial institution to be much more well prepared for any scenario that may occur to them. Financial institutions use a what-if analysis method by observing climate change patterns and begin to analyze a specific possible future that can be used to predict various different outcomes which may occur. In order to test the resilience of financial institutions in a possibly impacted by climate change, the scenarios used both have to be at the macro and sectoral levels, such as GDP, inflation, exchange rates, commodity prices, and etc. This is to ensure that they are able to adapt to the climate-related changes to the market, which could happen overnight. So by doing so, banks and investors are able to identify the strategies they need to undertake in order to mitigate any climate-related financial risks, as well as receive the exposure needed to make their next move. So in terms of critiques that we have for the author of the literature review, we do find some issues in his tone and style of work, as he provides too much background when discussing a certain topic, which makes it difficult to focus on what information he's trying to relay to the reader. However, he does provide extensive research, as we can see from the multiple references provided. This shows that he takes a lot of time to ensure that he provides relevant data needed for the review. In terms of his background, he does have multiple experiences in his field, such as being an honorary senior associate of UCL, as well as being part of the scientific advisory board member of the Spirkey's Group Climate and Nature-Related Financial Risk Project. On top of that, he was also a special research fellow of the Japan Financial Services Agency's Financial Research Center, and this shows that he is well versed in his field and has expert level knowledge on the topic that he is writing on.
Here are some of the regulatory impact imposed in the name of climate change risks. First off, new reporting standards have been developed that are endorsed by two sources, one of which is Article 173 of the French Energy Transaction Act, which strengthened the mandatory carbon disclosure requirements for listed companies. They also introduced carbon reporting to institutional investors, which covers environmental, social, and governance factors in decision-making, disclosing the disclosure to climate change risks that a company may face, as well as estimating the amount of greenhouse gases emission associated with the asset owned by that particular company. Furthermore, they also emphasize the role of climate institutions should practice. On the other hand, we have speech by Mark Carney called The Tragedy of the Horizon. The Tragedy of the Horizons highlight the paradox in which we know that climate change will be a catastrophe in the future, yet we currently do not take any incentive to take action. It highlights the cost of current inaction by scaling the future reaction required. This shows us a carbon budget that estimates how much emission the world can afford to maintain financial stability. Voluntary bodies such as TCFD has established following Carney's speech, and as key framework promoters, financial and non-financial companies will take into account their recommendations to make financial decisions and prepare reports. Now, moving on, we have regulatory impact that has already been taken into action. So this can be observed in the European Commission Sustainable Finance Action Plan in 2016, which aims to steer public and private capital funds into sustainable investment, mainstream sustainability into risk management practices, and to also promote transparency and long-term planning for financial and economic activities within prior EU borders.
In conclusion, it is essential that financial institutions abide by the policies and regulations which are being set in place to mitigate climate change. Furthermore, with the uncertainty of how the market may react due to climate changes, financial institutions must analyze all possible outcomes by utilizing climate change scenario analysis, as well as being able to identify the possible risk which will both directly and indirectly affect the financial system. Thank you.